Why do the rentals? That's my you're making more in rentals, and I'm not saying to not do the flips, but you're making more in rentals than 95% of America makes in a year. You're
Yeah.
you're cash flowing. Welcome everyone back to the Landlording Show. I'm your host Tim Harstead, and today we have a guest from Polebrook Capital, Bryce Madsen. Bryce, how's it going today?
Hey, I'm happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, man. So I put Bryce on. He's sort of been, I know we have a lot of younger, or whether age irrelevant, but newer investors coming in and that listen to the podcast. And Bryce is sort of, him and his company's been through it all, from being a smaller landlord to doing fix and flips to now he's more focused on the lending side. So wanted to bring Bryce on and sort of go through his story and show the world of what investing can become after you've been in it for a little while. So if you can, Bryce, just give us a little introduction of sort of your history with real estate investing and sort of where you got started and you got to where you are now.
Sure. Yeah, you bet. So we got started back in 2016 or so. So I know things, look very different now than they did back then. Things have changed quite a bit. But we got started back then and started, pretty traditional. We just did like kind of the house hacking method, which I'm sure most are familiar with. And so started with that, kind of tripped and fell into real estate. It's not like I didn't even know that there was like a term. I didn't know that it was coined house hacking at the time. Like I just bought a house and started renting out the bedrooms, and that turned out really well. And so about 2 years later, my whole life had kind of changed. Like I was getting married, things looked really different for me, and we actually ended up selling the original house that I had bought. And when I remember walking out of the title company with a check for $40,000, and coincidentally, that was exactly how much I was making at my W-2 job at the time. And so that's kind of when the light bulb moment went off for me. I was like, I just sold this house and made the exact same amount of money that I did at my job after working for an entire year. I should probably look more into this. So that was kind of the catalyst that kicked it all off for us. So we kind of dove headfirst into rentals, built a decently sized portfolio there, kind of ran out of some cash, moved into the flipping side of things. And then around COVID timeframe, we started to kind of transition out of that into the full-time lending space, which is where we're at now. So that's kind of the whole like start to finish on everything. I know there's a lot to unpack there, but that's kind of our journey in a nutshell.
We'll get back to the lending side of it. I want to dive a little bit deeper into sort of the struggles and successes that you had with the rentals and flips. I guess when getting started, when you went from that first house to, you had that 40 grand, um, how did you expand in terms of getting from, one house selling it to the multiple units that you have, in terms of like financing and figuring that out? That's what a lot of people struggle with. When I talk to them, is just how are you able to get the loans for more properties?
Yeah. That's a very common struggle, especially when you're starting out, when you don't have a lot of capital. So, we were pretty lucky in the sense that, my fiance at the time, or now wife, she was also house hacking, renting out the bedrooms with her first property. And so when we got married, we ultimately decided to sell my house and move into hers. And so we were lucky in the sense that we did have that that pretty sizable paycheck to get started. And the funny thing though is that, like, in hindsight, I probably should have kept that property as a rental and tapped into that equity and not sold it. But I don't know that I necessarily regret it. Like we took that 40 grand, we paid off the majority of my student loans, which was like not crazy. It was about $15,000 at the time. Paid off some credit card debt, some other stuff, and ultimately, when that was all said and done, we had probably about $15,000 left. So, not a huge amount of capital by any means. But we ended up taking that $15,000 and we used that for a down payment on like our first non-owner occupied rental property. And the nice thing was because I had sold my house and we were living with my wife, I wasn't on title with my, my wife's property. So I qualified for another like, first time home buyer owner occupied financing, which worked out really great. I think we put 5 grand down on that first rental, and then we put another 10,000 down on our next duplex, after that. So that kind of got the ball rolling, and we were able to steamroll from there.
Yeah. So talk more about the steam rolling. And I guess one other thing that people might want to know, where were these properties at in terms of state-wise or
Yeah,
what
so
city?
we're located in Idaho Falls, Idaho. So we're about 4 hours east of Boise. But
Mhm.
this was back in the day when you could, like, our first rental property was $93,000. I know people hear that and be like,
Yeah.
"Whoa, that's insane!" That's so cheap. But that's just kind of how it was. That was the market back then.
I'll say this for the people that are sort of doing, I feel like we all do that. I mean, I think we're both probably around the same age, elder millennial-ish. Uh, but like, people are like always talking about how much easier it was in the past, and so they don't do anything. It's not going to get any easier. Like our kids are
Agreed.
going to have a much harder time than we are now, and we're going to have a much harder time than we would have 10 years ago. And like, just investing never gets easier. You're never going to have the chance to buy Coca-Cola as cheap as you did in the 70s. That's the
Right.
stuff for it. So I think that's something that to sort of grasp is like, yeah, okay, you got it for so little, but money's easier to come by now for a lot of people. You can do more things to earn income and being able to invest it. Yes,
Totally. Well, and what's going to happen is if you don't invest now, you look back 5 years ago and think, oh man, everything was so cheap. So, like you said, it's not getting any cheaper. Like, yeah, you wish you could buy 20 years ago. I wish I bought Bitcoin 15 years ago. But like
Right.
I didn't. It's
Mm-hmm.
so tough. You could either sit and moan and complain about it, or you could do something to change your future.
So right, exactly, and so talk a little bit about we started talking about the steamrolling. So we used our first time buyer credit up, got that for the first rental. Now you're sitting with at this point 4 doors practically, a duplex and 2 houses, or how do you
Yeah, so
keep
the
rolling with that?
first property was actually it was kind of like a pseudo duplex. So it was a single
Okay.
family home, and then luckily there was also like just a mobile home trailer in the backyard. So that was kind of a freebie, and it worked out really well. So we bought the house, and then we got the trailer for free essentially. So we had that duplex. We bought another duplex. So we had 4 doors pretty quickly. But for the next couple of properties, so we bought another. I think we bought a duplex, and then we bought another fourplex. And to buy those properties, we got a HELOC on my wife's house. She had probably at this point, 100 grand worth of equity in her home. And so, yeah, we just tapped into that, and we were able to use, those funds for the down payments on the next properties. But after that, we were pretty tapped. That line of credit was pretty tapped out, and we weren't able to scale beyond that without getting, a little bit more creative, which we can talk about, further if you'd like.
Yeah, sure. So
Yeah.
we use the HELOC. I guess sort of explain that process. I actually have some people that will ask about that. So a HELOC's a line of credit that you take on equity. What's the difference between that versus a lot of people talk about the first strategy where they refinance and cash out? So
Totally.
why did you guys go the HELOC instead of the cash out?
Yeah, so honestly, back then a lot of it was just due to ignorance. Like I wasn't super familiar with like the Burr method. I just wasn't that experienced at the time. But I was well versed enough in the finance space to know that like, oh, this HELOC is kind of a thing. So for those who aren't familiar, it's basically just like a big fancy credit card, but instead of having no collateral, it's like it's collateralized against the equity that you have in your home. So say you have a home that's worth $300,000, you owe $200,000 on it. You can go to a bank and say, hey, I've got $100,000 worth of equity. Can I tap into this? And typically they'll say yes. They're not going to give you all $100,000 of that because they want to have some safety net on their side. But they might give you 50 grand or 40 grand or something that you can at least get started with. And that's a decently good option. I kind of have a different mindset with it now in the sense that, I personally don't believe that you should use a HELOC for, like down payments on rentals just because it's long-term financing. And so, you'll still have your payment on your HELOC, and now you've got this mortgage on this rental property. So you can probably convince yourself that it's cash flowing better than it is because you're not taking into account the payment on the HELOC that you use for the down payment on the rental property. So that's my own personal philosophy. Some people may disagree with me, but I would rather use that cash for a short term deal like a fix and flip.
Cool. So what did you get from there? So now we got 4 rentals. I guess before we go there, and if you remember this, we got the 2 duplexes. At that point, how did cash flow look, or what were your numbers running at around that?
Yeah, yeah. So in the first year, like once we got really serious about it, we got 12 doors in 12 months. And that's really the only reason I, remember it because it was so easy to remember 12 units in 12 months. And I believe like net cash flow after everything, like, mortgages, expenses, vacancy, maintenance, like CapEx, everything. We were cash flowing about $2,600 a month, which, at the time, even now, I know that's probably a good amount of change for a lot of people listening, but that was that was pretty life changing for us at the time. Like, we were kind of just young, poor, newlyweds, and an extra $2,600 a month coming into your bank account every month. That's substantial. That was life changing for us.
Were you guys self-managing at that time, or did you guys hire me,
Yeah,
or
we
did
were.
you guys do that?
Yep, yep. And the funny thing is, once we got up to like 40, 45 doors or so, we were still self-managing that entire time. I know a lot of people kind of cringe and be like, "Oh, why didn't you use a property manager?" But I, I personally, I don't believe in property managers. I just, I know a lot of people disagree with me, but that's just, I just don't, I don't know. I don't like that business model. But again, we can talk about that more in depth later. So.
What how many hours do you think you're putting in? How much time do you think you're putting in terms of those? Well, once you got into the 40, 45 doors.
Yeah, it was pretty minimal, just in the sense that I come from like an IT background, so that's what I went to school for and everything like that. So I was pretty good at setting up like automations and some systems and processes, so that like whenever we had maintenance requests, like nobody would call me. They would go onto the online board and they would submit it there. All of our rent collection that was automated. I wasn't driving around and collecting checks, so like pretty much anything that had to be done was automated. Um, at the peak, we did have like a full time maintenance guy that was on our payroll. I think we paid him $60,000 or $65,000 a year, and so he would wake up in the morning and get on that online board and just see what he kind of had to do for the day. And then he also helped us with some of the flip projects too. So, um, I like I said, we did it in a good enough way that it wasn't super time consuming. I'd say maybe 5 to 10 hours a week. And that's ultimately why I decided to self manage, just because it saved us a lot of money and it wasn't that big of a time suck for us.
So we have the 40 doors. If you don't remember it, what do you think at that point you're flowing your peak?
Yeah, we like in total cash flow from those 40 doors.
I guess let's do both. If you know it, total cash flow, but more so after you paid down the mortgage, after you paid everything. What were you netting a month?
Yeah. If I remember right, like net cash flow was 12,000 or so. So like it was pretty sizable. And then I think that was right around like a $5 million portfolio or so. Like if you count all the total values of all the buildings. Yeah.
Well, that's another big questions we never answered. So we end up getting rid of all of them to start focusing more on flips and lending, right?
We did, yeah. So we actually got to a point after the first 12 units where we were completely out of cash. Like we were totally tapped out. Like we obviously we saw the vision. We kind of had like a taste of the good life. Like, this is awesome. We want to keep doing it. But we ran out of cash. So, most people would maybe throw their hands up in the air and say, okay, well, I guess we can't keep going, or I guess we'll just keep stockpiling this cash flow until we have enough money for another down payment. But I was talking to probably a good friend of mine, not so much like a mentor, but he was doing really well in real estate. And he's like, have you guys ever thought about flipping? And I don't know why that like was so profound to me at the time, but I had just never even considered that. Like I had seen like Chip and Joanna Gaines on HGTV, and that was pretty much my only extent with my background in flipping. But he said, yeah, if you're running out of cash, maybe try flipping a house or two, and then you could take the proceeds from that and use that as the down payment on your next rental to kind of keep building this empire. And so that's exactly what we did. We started with our first flip project, and if I remember right, it took a little bit longer to rehab and remodel, just because there were all the learning and everything with that. But it sat on the market a little longer than we'd hoped. But ultimately, when it ended up selling, I think we made $26,000 or something like that. So we used that to buy our next rental, and then we just kept rinsing and repeating, and that was how we eventually scaled to up to the 40 units after the first 12. But the funny thing is that after we started doing that, we got really like heavily into the flips. Like, we really enjoyed them. So for example, my wife, she was really into like the paint colors and the decorating and making them all cutesy and like, experimenting with all that. And I was, less interested in that, but I enjoyed the construction aspect of it. Like, I enjoyed meeting with the contractors and kind of having this whole vision for everything. And then at the end of everything too, it was fun to, see this turd that you picked up, and now it's a slightly less ugly turd, that you've polished. And, the paychecks at the end were always nice too. So we just kind of got more into that, and we're like, you know what, maybe we just start doing this all together. And that's when we kind of decided, oh, okay, let's maybe transition into the flips full time and kind of leave the rentals in the past.
Why do the rentals? That's like you're making more in rentals, and I'm not saying to not do the flips, but you're making more in rentals than 95% of America makes in a year. You're cash flowing. You're barely putting any effort into it. Why get rid of that cash flow?
So it's a good question, and it's something that we struggled with for a really long time. For whatever reason, and this is just like a personal take, and I don't think this stands for most people. For whatever reason, the rentals just kind of like weighed on our mind, So like, even though it was automated, even though it was kind of hands off and other people took care of it, for whatever reason, like, I still had trouble sleeping at night, knowing that I had like all of these properties, all of these roofs to take care of, all of this snow removal, all this maintenance, even if it was outsourced and kind of delegated. It just, I don't know. And then I as much as people say that they won't or that they shouldn't, I would get like kind of emotionally connected to those properties. So we'd have a tenant who would move out. We would go in and do paint and carpet and fix them up and make them nice. We'd re-rent it. And then as soon as the tenant would move out, great. A year later, we have to go and redo the paint and the carpet and everything again. Even if, we vetted the tenant and they were really great, people just don't take care of your stuff the same way that you would. So, I agree. A lot of people like disagree with that. They're like, you're insane for selling all these properties because you've got the appreciation and, everything else that you're writing off and all that. But, I think at some point it's less about the financials and more just about like the peace of mind. And so that's why we decided, let's move into the flips, because like I said, we really enjoyed that, and that worked out okay for us. And on top of that, another thing that I was just thinking of, once, at least for us, like, I don't know about you, but I'm not like, I don't care about having like yacht money or Lambo money. Like, I'm not a super flashy guy. And so once we had enough to like cover all of our expenses, I think our expenses at the time were $4,000 or $5,000 a month, so we were pocketing a good amount of that. It didn't really like materially change our lives that much, because we weren't like going and, doing crazy things with it. So we would kind of just like stockpile that into an account, and then we would use that for another flip. And I started getting addicted more to like the bigger paychecks, the $30,000, the 40, the $50,000, rather than a couple $100 here and there, every single month. So I don't know. That's a long-winded answer to your question, but that's ultimately why we made that switch.
Well, I think I'll leave that answer as my case for why you hire a property manager. You threw away, I mean, they said, you're throwing away 140 a year that, whether you're flip, whether you're using to pay your expenses, all that stuff, because you get emotionally attached. And we see it all the time where we'll have people that call us and they're like, well, I don't want to get this tenant because I know them and blah, 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 and they're not paying.
Right.
At the end of the day, if you don't treat it like a business, it becomes way more, it becomes way that burden. And that's, I think, a mistake a lot of people make is they don't treat it, and I'll use a term that we both know well, this is how we know each other, but we don't buy that over time, we don't treat it the right way, and it becomes that burden, versus, hiring a property manager now instead of, 12 grand, you're making 8 grand a month, but you're still, that money's coming in, all your expenses, and you can go and do whatever you want to do on the flip side, and it's all just gravy, expense wise. So then we move into the flips. What else, where are we at with that? Are we still doing flips and lending, or did we start to get out of the flips too?
Yeah, so that, let me think. I'm trying to remember my timeline. We went like really heavily into the flips until right around when COVID hit. I remember one project in particular we had on the books for I want to say 14 months. Like it was way longer than it should have been. Like just about everything that could have gone wrong with that project did go wrong. And mostly it was just due to supply shortages and things like that. So with this property, for example, everything was done except for baseboard. We could not find baseboard. It was nowhere. I called all the warehouses around. Nobody had it. I was calling people in a 12-hour or radius. I was like, I will drive down there with a trailer and pick up baseboard if you have it, because that's the last thing that I need for this house before it can sell. So ultimately we ended up getting, we got baseboard, we finished up the project, and we ended up selling that project. But when we sold that property, I remember looking at the HUD statement, and we didn't lose money on it, but we barely made anything. I think we made $1,200 after all the headache and time that we spent. And I remember looking at that HUD statement, and even though we had made $1,200, our hard money lender at the time had made $25,000. And so that's when the light bulb moment went off for us. I was like, hey, hang on. We did all of this work for all of these months, all of this headache, all these sleepless nights. And this guy probably didn't even lose an ounce of sleep over the year or whatever that we had his money out. So that's when I was like, I think we want to transition into this. So for a while, we kind of did a little bit of the balancing act. We would still do the flips, and then any excess capital that we had, we would lend out. But slowly, we just started buying fewer and fewer flips and then moving that capital over into the lending. And then probably about 2022 into 2023, that's when we quit doing flipping full time and all together, and just strictly went into.
One more question on the flip side: when you guys were at your peak, so probably right before COVID, or not obviously COVID messed up everything. The fact that you couldn't get any. I mean, fixing furnaces, fixing a roof leak, everything that could come at us as a property manager. It took extra time, it took extra money, and they were literally just times where we literally can't replace your water heater because there's no water heater. We're in Chicago. You're in a small town. You might have 1 or 2 Home Depots. We got 40 or 50 Home Depots, and
they're all out.
No one had them. Yep. They're all out. So I mean, it was crazy. So I do understand that. But when you're at your peak, how many houses do you think you're flipping in a year?
We were in 23. We did 22. We did our highest, and that was just under 25 flips in a year. And we grossed just under $1 million that year. That was our peak year with the house flips.
That was in terms of when you say gross, in terms of what you but
Sorry,
honest
sorry.
or
We netted just under $1 million. I should have said gross. Yeah,
cool.
netted with
Yeah, you're good.
after everything. Yeah, gross is not that impressive, but net. Yeah, we were just shy. It was like 970,000. I remember looking at like my P&L for the year, and I was like, ah man, we should have had one more, so we could have like hit that $1 million mark. But
Right there. Yeah, for sure. Cool. So, all right, you do that. Now, for people that are thinking about, all right, I want to get to that level and at some point go into lending or help others out. What kind of capital did you start with for that project? When you decide, hey, we're going to start doing lending, like it's not. A lot of people get into house hacking and get into that because you don't need a whole lot of money down and assume that for lending you need to have a little bit more funds. What did you guys sort of allocate towards that when you started?
yeah, so you definitely have to have something to start lending, but like there's other ways to take on other people's capital and things like that. But we started with just around like $1 million. And actually I take that back. Even like our first loan, I think our first loan was for 200,000 or so, and that was just like I said, we had excess capital sitting in there that we weren't using for the flip, so we loaned that out, and then that pretty soon after that, we're like, oh, I like this, and so that's when we started allocating more. So yeah, we had about $1 million in cash liquid before we kind of started going all in, and obviously it's grown since then. But yeah, that's what we started with.
What kind of return are you seeing? Like if you're whether it's year over year, or I'm assuming you're doing more short-term fix and flip loans, or
We are.
yeah. So what kind of return on your money do you see when you're doing lending versus doing your own flip? Going back to that here with your lender.
So when we lend our own funds, because we have some like points and things like that, it works out to be roughly like 20% annualized, which is that's pretty good money. When we bring on other people's capital, we'll typically pay them anywhere from 9 to 12% based off what they have invested with us. So obviously we take kind of a spread on that interest and things like that, but we've got a lot of investors who have been like very pleased with their returns just because it's so passive. Like they just wire us funds and then they get paychecks, and they really enjoy that aspect. But yeah, like I said, when we're exclusively doing our own, it's about 20% annualized, which we're very pleased with. Could we make more money flipping? Yes, but it's also significantly more passive and way less headache and less time consuming for us. So I think it kind of just depends on like what era of your business you're in. Are you actively trying to grow these funds, or are you ready to kind of like preserve the capital a little bit and just sit back and collect more more interest?
What do you guys think between you and your wife? What are your goals right now in terms of? When we talk about the rentals, and you guys aren't living that lavish lifestyle. You guys are in Idaho, which no offense to Idaho, but expense-wise, your guys' mortgage is, I don't even know where you live, but my house is probably half your size and triple the price.
I'm sure it is. Yep.
No idea what yours looks like, and you don't know mine, but like I was just by Idaho versus Chicago.
Totally.
But like, what sort of is what's your guys' goal in terms of finances and what you're trying to get to? What kind of point are you guys trying to get to with investing?
Yeah, so like I said, we're still pretty small. We're sitting right around like 2.5 million right now between our own funds and investor funds. I would like to be at 10 million by this time next year, and within the next 2 or 3 years, hopefully be at 25 million or so, and just really go all in on the lending piece, just because we love it, and it's in my mind, it's the best of both worlds because I still get to be in real estate. I still get to like run the numbers, analyze the deals, make sure that everything makes sense and pencils out. But I don't have to be the guy swinging the hammers or delegating or going to Home Depot and picking up lumber and all that stuff. I get the best of both worlds, and I don't know. We really like that. So that's kind of the 3 to 5 year horizon for us.
And you're making 20 points on this. You goal. Realizing 1 or 2 with less effort than your fixing flips.
Yep, absolutely.
Awesome. What pitfalls sort of scare you with this one? Like what are the things that you're not necessarily, obviously what scares you is that the house doesn't sell, you don't get your money back. But like, what are you looking for ahead of time to avoid those pitfalls? That's probably a better way to ask that question.
Totally. Yeah. So the biggest things, obviously, the first and foremost is collateral. If somebody comes to us with a project and the numbers just don't make sense, like we would never issue a $200,000 loan on a $200,000 property just because there's no equity spread there. So we're typically around like 75 to 80% LTV. It depends a lot on the borrower as well, their background, their history, their level of experience. But so biggest thing is obviously collateral. Borrower is second in line to that. Mainly because I've got a firm belief that if you can't handle your own personal finances, you're not going to be able to handle our finances or a renovation project, much less. So collateral first, borrower second. And other than that, there's a couple other things that we look in. We want to make sure that we have adequate insurance coverage and things like that. But those two are very much the highest priorities that we look at.
What do you need in terms of to be able to give loans and stuff like that? Is there any kind of licensure or anything like that you got to go get, or is it something that if someone has the funds, they can sort of just figure it out?
Yeah, so good question. There's a lot of caveats to this. So it depends on the state that you're in. It also depends on how you set things up. So without getting too crazy into detail, there's really two main like lending models. The first one is what I call like a direct placement or like a trust deed investing, which in layman's terms, basically like say you have a loan for $100,000 you want to do, you'll go get investor A, B, and C with $33,000, 33 at each, and then you kind of carve up that note or that deed of trust, and you essentially just say, okay, you get 33% of this project, you get 33, you get 33, and then you can take a section off the top. The other common way to do it is setting up like a real estate fund with the SEC. That's definitely a little bit more involved. There's more kind of red tape and guidelines and regulation and things, and also the legals to set that up is pretty expensive. That's the route that we ultimately ended up going, just because we like that model. So we have investors invest in the fund, they subscribe to the fund, they send their funds, and then we can kind of divvy it out and allocate it however we want. But as far as like the licensing goes, it's actually fairly minimal. As long as you're lending to a like an LLC borrower on a non-owner occupied property, the regulation is actually very minimal. You've got, for example, if you live on the East Coast, there's almost no states that I can think of that require a license. I think maybe Vermont and like one or two others. Most of the licensing required is on like the West Coast. So California, Utah. Here in Idaho, we do have licensing, but it's fairly easy. You just have to become like a licensed mortgage officer. Go through your course, get your NMLS number, and then again, as long as you're not lending on owner occupied properties, it's pretty much free reign. So it's the rules and regulations are far and few between.
Are you lending just in Idaho, or are you guys in multiple states, or when do you guys decide to do that?
Yeah, I'd say probably 90% of everything we do is in Idaho. We do have a handful of small projects in like Alabama and Oklahoma, mainly because we've had past borrowers in Idaho who have moved to Oklahoma or Alabama, and they're like, hey, we used you in the past, would you mind lending on these projects here? And we're like, okay, sure. Like we know you, we know you're a good borrower, you can perform and you have the experience, so sure. But I'd say like I know the Idaho market the most, just because this is where our business was and that's where we were flipping. So maybe at some point once we grow, we'd like to expand and go nationwide, but for the time being, yeah, we'll just be basically in Idaho for the foreseeable future.
I want to thank you for coming and sort of just enlightening everyone that the multiple ways that you can be profitable and make a living doing real estate, because a lot of people don't really look past their fix and flippers or their buy and hold, and they don't sort of spread out. So it's interesting to talk to someone that's done it all and sort of give a viewpoint from all three of those spots.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that. No, I'm glad to be here, and hopefully I've been able to impart some wisdom or some little tidbit of information that can help the audience. So,
listen, Bryce, we'll leave all your contact info and stuff like that below in all the descriptions and stuff. So if you guys want to get a hold of Bryce and ask him more questions or see, what his lending can do if you're especially in the Idaho area, or just have questions on that, we'll leave all that for you. And thanks for joining us again, and we'll see you guys all next time.